Protesters have taken out their anger on a statue of Egerton Ryerson in Toronto. He's considered the architect of Canada's residential school system for Indigenous children. The system is back in the spotlight after the remains of more than 200 First Nation children were found in unmarked graves at the country's biggest residential school in the western city of Kamloops.
Under those orange flags, lined up in rows, 1 meter by 1 meter apart.
As of yesterday, we have hit 751 unmarked graves.
What has happened to Indigenous people in this country is genocide.
The memories and the pain that has been triggered by the discovery of these graves is significant, but it's also been a moment for all Canadians to understand that this is our shared history, but it's also part of our present, that the inequities and the challenges faced by Indigenous Canadians are a direct result of decisions we took as governments and as institutions many decades ago. That's why I told the chief from Kamloops that
when it comes to countries with skeletons in their closets, Canada isn't usually among the first ones to come to mind. But in the recent years, you may have heard of residential schools, or more specifically, the thousands of unmarked graves found beside these schools. So, what happened at these residential schools that caused the deaths of so many Indigenous children? In 1907, Dr. Bryce published the Bryce Report after visiting and reporting on the conditions in residential schools. What he found shocked the whole country. After visiting about 35 schools, he found that over 25% of all the children that had attended these schools had died. And at one school, the rate was as high as 70%. To put this in context, a soldier deployed into the hellfire of World War I had better odds of survival than children put into these schools. In this video, I will investigate how the mass graves of unnamed children came to be, from tuberculosis and disease to the sickening and abominable treatment they received, akin to concentration camps during the Holocaust. As said in the Bryce Report, tuberculosis was the most common cause of death in the residential schools. However, its severity was multiplied due to the malnutrition and the poor medical care children received. According to Mayo Clinic, tuberculosis is a bacterial infection that mainly affects the lungs, which can be fatal if left untreated. It usually spreads when a sick person coughs or sneezes, scattering droplets in the air, meaning it spreads like wildfire in a crowded indoor environment with poor ventilation, like in the schools. Furthermore, many of the schools were reported to be overcrowded, leading to the rampant spreading of infectious diseases apart from tuberculosis. This was because the schools took in more students to get more funding from the province, but they didn't have the housing space nor the funding in the first place to properly accommodate them. They would also take in sick kids to meet enrollment quotas. Consequently, the dorms and classrooms had much more people than they should. This, along with inadequate ventilation, allowed diseases to be transmitted rapidly. The schools were also abysmally constructed and administered, prioritizing cutting costs over safety and habitability. The poor ventilation, or lack thereof, made them extremely uncomfortable and meant that the air remained stagnant. Sick students were sometimes transferred to Indian hospitals, where only Indigenous people were treated. The students, among other patients, received poor health care and hospitality due to an utter lack of doctors and trained medical staff, being no better than the residential schools. This predicament meant that most students that needed health care never received it. The excessive number of students also meant that malnutrition and starvation were common because of a low supply of food due to high demand and abysmal funding. In short, while tuberculosis was a factor in the deaths of thousands of children, to say that the disease alone is to blame would be a half-truth. The government chronically underfunded residential schools, leaving them unable to provide proper care or living conditions for students. Schools were funded based on enrollment numbers, incentivizing overcrowding to receive adequate funding. To address the spread of tuberculosis, they could have hired more medical staff to provide sufficient care for the sick, but they did not. Ultimately, the entire foundation of these schools, rooted in the philosophy of kill the Indian and save the man, reflects the government's apathy toward the inhumane conditions and the children's suffering. With all these factors in mind, we see how neglect and utter disregard for human life led to the thousands of preventable deaths in the residential schools.
The Canadian government created and helped run the residential school system, which was meant to kill the Indian in the child. After being forced to leave their families, many children suffered horrific abuses, such as rape, torture, and even death.
Aside from tuberculosis, many children also died due to neglect, abject mistreatment, and even failed escape attempts. The Cooper Island School near Vancouver Island holds many grim stories about abuse and death. It even earned the notorious nickname Canadian Alcatraz due to being impossible to escape because of its isolation. An endless number of heartbreaking stories emerged from this school of sexual abuse, beatings, and even one about a staged suicide. Richard Thomas was just days away from graduation when he allegedly took his own life. His death remains shrouded in mystery, especially because of his statement during a phone call with his sister. "When I get out of here, I'm going to tell everything," referring to the abuse he sees in the schools. He is described in interviews as smart, well-loved, and ambitious, as he wanted to pursue more education than what the residential schools offer. This only adds on to the mystery, as he was found hanging from a rope in the school gymnasium just days later. Cooper Island is one of the most infamous residential schools across Canada. Scattered all over the island are the remains of students whose deaths remain shrouded in mystery and covered up, much like in the case of Richard Thomas. The stories truly highlight the wickedness that was behind these schools, and I recommend listening to the Cooper Island podcast to learn more about the events that transpired. The death toll of residential schools isn't limited to the schools themselves. According to a survey done on health and socioeconomic conditions in reserves, many residential school survivors are at a higher risk of committing suicide and have higher rates of alcoholism and drug abuse. Not to mention the distraught families and especially the parents of children who attended and never came home. Canada's residential schools were instruments of genocide that resulted in thousands of unmarked graves and trauma that will affect generations. From tuberculosis and starvation to abuse and cover-ups, the schools embody the neglect and apathy the government had for the well-being of Indigenous communities and children. Williams Lake First Nation Chief Willie Sellers said that there can be no reconciliation before there is truth, so I made this video to achieve the latter. The government must acknowledge and take accountability for these atrocities, which they are in the process of doing so thanks to emerging programs that are assisting in reconciliation, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which helps uncover our history, repairs the damage done by the schools, and gives closure to the families whose children were stolen. By making this video, I hope to honor the unfortunate ones whose lives were left in ruin because of these schools, the survivors who returned home, and the ones who did not.